Hey guys, what's going on? It's Dave from Evil Eye Games. Today's video, I want to go ahead and set up a dissolve for our characters so with that when they die, they look like they disintegrate. Now, before we get started with that, I just wanted to bring up one other issue that was occurring due to the ragdolls, and you may not even have noticed that it existed. So to highlight this, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to open up our enemy character blueprint. And in the viewport here, we see that our enemy character has his capsule. So I'm going to select our capsule component in the left here. And to the right, I'm going to go ahead and let's see if I can find it again. Under rendering here, it's hidden in game is checked to true. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to uncheck that and compile and save this. And I'm going to go ahead and demonstrate what the problem is. So I have our test map loaded up, and if I hit play, I'm going to go ahead and we can now see the character capsules here for our enemies. I'm going to go ahead and shoot this guy dead. And you'll notice that the character capsule ends up remaining. And I don't know how visible it is going to be on the video, but there is an outline of the character capsule present right in front of me. But if my character tries to walk through it, it still blocks my character. I can't pass through that capsule. So if you're shooting at an enemy and you run at it, that character capsule will continue to block your movement and it will continue to exist. So what we're going to need to do to fix this is I'm going to go back into the capsule component here and I'm going to go ahead and make it hidden in a game again. Actually, no, I'm going to hold off on that so we can test this out. We're going to go back into the event graph here. And at the end, after we add our impulse, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to grab a reference to our capsule component. I'm going to just drag it out onto the graph here. And we're going to drag out and we're going to search for set collision enabled. And we're going to leave this as a new type for no collision. And what this is going to do is it's going to turn off the collision of this capsule. So if I go ahead and compile and save and hit play again, and we go ahead and kill these enemies, we can see that the capsule still remains, but if I try to walk through the capsule component, it no longer blocks my character. So I can pass straight through the capsule after the enemy is dead. So at this point, I am going to go ahead and set the capsule back to hidden in game and compile and save it. And we can close out of our enemy character for now. Now I want to go ahead and make a material function for our enemy that is going to do our dissolve for us. And I'm going to end up putting this in our characters folder in the mannequin folder here. There's an actual materials folder. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to right click and we're going to go into materials and textures and I'm going to create a new materials function. And I'm just going to call this our dissolve function. And we're going to go ahead and double click this and open it up. Now this is going to get a little complex, so I am going to put up a image on Imgur of this material function so that you can track it. And then it'll be easier for you to follow along. So I'll leave a link for that down below. The other thing I want to note is that I got a lot of this from the Shooter Tutorial Online, which is a great resource. And I'm going to put the direct link into that below as well. Now I'm going to be doing some things slightly differently than the way he does it. And there are a couple of different reasons for doing so, and I'll get to those when I actually implement the differences. So the first thing that we're going to want to do is we want to go ahead and start off to the left here. So the first thing we want to do over here is we want to start off, I'm going to right click into our graph here and we're going to add in a constant. And I'm going to go ahead and right click and convert it to a parameter. And then on the left here, I'm going to go ahead and we're going to call this parameter the emissive blend size. And I'm going to set the default value of this to 5. And then we're going to want to take this and we're going to want to divide it. And then I'm going to click on the divide, and the constant b here that we're going to divide by is going to be 100. And we're going to take our result here, and we're going to go ahead and add. And we're going to want to create another parameter, so I'm going to go ahead and, alternatively to right-clicking and searching for a constant, you can hold the number 1 key and left-click in the graph, and it will produce a single constant. And I'm going to right-click and convert this to a parameter, and we're going to call this the dissolve amount. Now I'm going to set the slider value on here between 0 and 1, and I'm going to set the default value here to a -1. And we want to take this value and we want to plug it into the B of our add. The next thing we're going to need is an if statement. So I'm going to search for if. And then for the value of our add, we're going to go ahead and we're going to plug this into our A is greater than or equal to B. We're then going to go ahead and plug our dissolve amount into the A. And we're going to need another parameter, so I'm going to hold 1 and click in the graph. I'm going to set it to a value of 0. And I'm going to plug this value into the B. And I'm also going to plug it into the A equals B, and the A is less than B. And then we're going to go ahead and we're going to need another if statement. And I'm going to take the output of our first if statement and plug it into the A value here. And then we're going to need a texture. And this texture is going to be the dissolve texture. And so for a texture, I ended up just Googling a water caustics type texture. The important things for this texture is that it's going to have to be in black and white, and it's going to have to be a square. So if I go to my download folder here, I have a exported file, and I want to go ahead and I'm going to import this into our textures folder. So I'm going to grab this and I'm going to drag and I'm going to drop it over here into our textures folder for a mannequin. Now I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to provide a link to this image as well. And I'm going to hit save all once we've gone ahead and imported it. And we're going to return to our dissolve function. And I'm just going to break this off into its own window real fast. And I'm just going to drag and drop this dissolve texture into our window here. And it'll give us a texture sample. So this texture sample is going to end up plugging into our B. So off of our white lead here, I'm going to go ahead and plug this into our B. Now I'm also going to need a constant 3 vector. So I'm going to hold the 3 button and left click in the graph. And we're going to get this black image. Now this black image, I am going to go ahead and I want to plug this output into the A is equal to B and the A is less than B plugs as well. Then finally, we're going to need a sample for actual dissolve color. So once again, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to hold 3 and click in the graph for a vector parameter. And I'm going to click on this, and for the constant here, this constant we're going to set to the color of the dissolve that we actually want. So this is the color of the dissolving effect. So I'm going to set this to a blue or something, and we're going to hit OK. And I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to plug this into our A is greater than or equal to B. Finally, we're going to go ahead and we're going to take the output of this if statement, and we're going to search for multiply. And we want to go ahead and multiply this by a constant as well. So I'm going to hold 1, click in the graph, and I'm going to plug this into the B. And then for the value of this, we're going to actually convert this to a parameter. And I'm going to call the parameter name for this the dissolve power. And for the default value, I'm going to set this to 35. Now to the right of this, I'm going to right click and we're going to search for Make Material Attributes. And we're going to take the result of this multiply and we're going to plug it into the emissive color. And we're going to plug our output into our output resolve. And it seems that I plugged the wrong node in here. So I'm going to break this texture sample link. And we actually want to take the value from the red and plug it into our B. So if we go ahead and go to save again, the error message on our if statement will have resolved itself. Now finally, we're going to need a opacity mask as well. So I'm going to right click in our graph here and we're going to put in another if statement. And we're going to plug the outputting result into the opacity mask. And for this, we're going to need a couple of constants. So once again, I'm going to use the number 1 and click into our graph. The first one we're going to need is going to be a value of 0, and the second one is going to be a value of 1. And we're going to plug our 0 here into the A is greater than equal to B, as well as the A is equal to B. And we're going to plug our 1 into A is less than B. And we're going to need to take our dissolve amount parameter, and we're going to go ahead and we're going to plug this into the A value. And then we're going to take the red output from our texture sample, and we're going to plug this into the B. So overall, this is what our material is going to look like. So what we're essentially doing here is we have an emissive blend size here, and this is going to control the border between what has been made invisible versus what hasn't as of yet. The dissolve amount parameter here is going ahead and it's going to control the amount of the material that's already been dissolved. And it's going to use this pattern in this texture sample to determine what is dissolved and what hasn't been dissolved yet. Our color up here is going to determine the glow at the edge. So this emissive blend size, that border is going to glow, and it's going to make it look like our character is disintegrating. Finally, we have the dissolve power over here, and this dissolve power is going to control how much this emissive blend size glows. So at this point, we can go ahead and save this. And we're going to go back to our main window for our folder. And in our materials here, we're going to have to make modifications to the UE4 mannequin materials. Now, one thing you'll notice is that there's 2 materials for the mannequin itself. So I'm going to start with the UE4 man body. And the first thing you'll notice is that this doesn't look like a traditional material. And we're going to have to kind of change that a little bit. So in the left-hand side here, for our details, the material domain of surface is going to be fine. We're going to want the blend mode to be masked. And finally, we're going to want to uncheck the use material attributes. Now, unfortunately, this doesn't play well with the parameters that the material originally uses. So I'm going to right-click over here and break the link. And we want to drag out from the display AO the final function, and we want to go ahead and break the material attributes. And then we want to go ahead and plug these in. So our base color to our base color, the metallic to metallic, specular to specular, the roughness to roughness. We're not going to need to deal with the emissive color, the opacity, the passive mask. We are going to want to plug in the normal here. And we're going to want to plug in the ambient occlusion. So we're going to go ahead and save this. Now we're going to want to bring our dissolve function into this material. So I'm going to go ahead and bring this off to the side here in a separate window. And I'm going to drag our dissolve function onto our graph. And we're going to take this dissolve function and we're going to go ahead and drag off from the result. And we want to go ahead and break the material attributes. Now, in the actual dissolve function itself, the only material attributes that we plugged in were the emissive color and the opacity mask. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to take the emissive color, plug that in, and we'll take the opacity mask and plug that into our final material results. So at this point, we're going to go ahead and save that. And so that's going to finish the way that we end up making our materials. So if we take a look at our characters out here, they still look the same, but we have added in that additional material function, if I can get the camera here placed properly. And we won't have to make any changes to the actual chest logo, because the chest logo is actually a material instance of the main body. Now, if you're using a character that you created yourself or a character that was put together, you're going to have to do the same thing if the materials for the different components on the character are different. In this case, the chest logo, if we mouse over it, shows that it's a material instance, and it's a material instance of our UE4 man body. So that being the case, we don't have to actually update the chest logo. But you're going to have to take a look at your character and the individual materials. And if the materials are all separate materials, you are going to have to, in fact, modify each one of the materials so that it will do the dissolve. So the next thing that we're going to actually have to end up doing is we're going to create a component for the mannequin character. So in the folder for, let's say, the mesh here, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to right click, and we're going to go to a new blueprint class, and we want to add a new actor component. And I'm going to call this our dissolve component. And we're going to go ahead and open up our dissolve component. And we're going to have to make a couple of functions inside of our dissolve component here. Now, I'm going to create a custom event. And I'm going to call this get meshes. And from our get meshes here, I'm going to drag out and we're going to perform a sequence. And what we want this function to do is it's going to be a component of the character itself. We're going to add it to the character. We want it to go ahead and grab all of the static meshes and all of the skeletal meshes and get their materials. So what we're going to do here is I'm going to right click in the graph and I'm going to search for get owner. And we want to go ahead and drag off of this and get a component by class. And for this, we want the component class to be the static mesh. So we'll search for static mesh component, and that's going to return an array. So we're going to want to go ahead and perform a for each loop. And we're going to connect our then 0 to this for each loop. Just move it aside like here. And then for each item that's listed in our array of static mesh components, we want to go ahead and drag out from the array element, and we want to get the materials. And this is going to return an array of all of the materials for each of the static meshes. So if a static mesh happens to have more than one material, it'll get all of those materials. So once again, we want to perform a for each loop. And we're going to plug our loop body into this for each loop here. And I opened up the macro by accident. And what we're going to do is for each array element, we're going to go ahead and we're going to search for a create a dynamic material instance. We're going to plug this into our loop body. And we've created a parent. So let me undo this. I'm going to click directly into the graph, and we're going to search for create dynamic material instance. And we're going to plug our loop body into the execution pin and the array element into the parent. So from here, we're going to actually grab the original for each loop array element. And we're going to drag over here and we're going to search for set material. And we want to go ahead and connect our execution pin up. And we're going to connect our array index for our internal loop here to the element index. And then we want to connect our dynamic material instance into the material node. And I will go ahead and put in a few rewrote nodes here so we can be clear as to what's connected to what. And then we want to go ahead and create an array of all the materials so that we can cycle through them. So we're going to need a new variable. And I'm going to call this materials to dissolve. And then for the type of the variable here, we're going to search for a material instance. And we want a reference. And then we want to go over to the details pane over here and check on it to make sure that it is an array. So we're going to grab our materials to dissolve here. We're going to go ahead and get it. And we're going to go ahead and drag out, and we're going to search for add. And we're going to connect this, our execution pin in. And we want to add this created dynamic material instance to it. So that covers our static meshes. All right, so what we're going to do then is we're going to have to fill out the then one pin. So we're going to do the same exact thing we did up here, but you can't just copy and paste it because these for each loop instances are specific to the array that it's using. So from our get owner here, we're going to drag off, and we're going to go ahead and get our component, if I can spell correctly, by class. And we're going to set the component class to skeletal mesh component. We're then going to drag off from our return array and search for a for each loop. And then once again from the array element here, we're going to go ahead and get materials. And then from this array, we're going to go ahead and perform a for each loop. And we'll go ahead and connect our loop body into the execution pin here. And then from our array element, we'll search for, actually we'll click in the graph and search for create dynamic material instance. And we'll connect up the execution pin and the array element to the parent. And then we'll go ahead and from our original for each loop, we'll drag off and we'll search for set material. And we'll go ahead and plug in the execution pin. And we'll plug our return value from the create dynamic material instance into the material. And we'll connect our array instance or our array index from the for each loop into the element index. And we can go ahead and plug in a reroute node here. And then we can go ahead and I'm going to just move this down here. And we're going to search for an add. And then we want to go ahead and add the return value from our create dynamic material instance into our add. And I will go ahead and put some reroute nodes in here as well. And we're going to go ahead and compile and save. And we can connect our then one pin into the for each loop. And once again, compile and save. So what we're effectively doing here when we get our meshes is first we're going ahead and we're grabbing our owner, which is going to be the character itself that this component belongs to. It's going to go ahead and get components by class of our static mesh components. It's going to perform a for each loop on each component, where it's going to go ahead and get all of the materials for that component. And for each one of those materials, we're going to create a dynamic material instance. And then we're going to go ahead and set the material and add it to an array. Likewise, we're going to do the same thing where we're going to get all the skeletal mesh components. We're going to perform a for each loop on each one of the skeletal meshes. We're going to get those materials. And for each one of the materials, we're going to create a dynamic material instance, set it, and then add it into our array. Now, this is where I'm going to vary from the Shoot It tutorial on how we actually implement the dissolving effect itself. In the original, he uses a tick event to go ahead and update the current dissolve. But I want to actually use a timeline, and a timeline is not something that you can use within a component. So that's going to have to be handled by the actual character itself. So essentially what we're going to want to do here is, well, first I'll go ahead and put a comment box around here, and we'll just comment that we're getting all meshes and their materials. All right, and one thing that I want to correct really fast is I forgot to sort of make a distinction between this. For our materials to dissolve variable right here, it should actually be a material instance dynamic. So we're going to switch it over to the material instance dynamic reference, and we're going to pop up with this dialog here to change variable type. So we're going to go ahead and change it. And then we're going to go ahead and compile and save. And we want to make sure that is a dynamic material. So we're going to have to create a custom event now. So I'm going to right click and create a custom event. And we're going to go ahead and call this set dissolve %. What we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and we're going to get our materials to dissolve. And then for each one of these, we're going to search for a for each loop. So for each one of these, we're going to go ahead and the array element, we're going to set a scalar parameter value. Now, if you don't see this set scalar parameter value, that is probably going to be because the materials to dissolve is a material instance and not a material instance dynamic. So you want to double check on that and make sure that this is actually a material instance dynamic. And we're going to have to give it a parameter name and a value. Now, if we look at the actual dissolve function here, we have our parameter, which is the dissolve amount. So this is what we're going to want to set. And once again, this is a name, so I'm just going to directly copy this. And I'm going to go ahead and paste it into the parameter name here. And then we're going to need to feed it a value. So for our custom event, I'm going to go ahead and add a new input. It's going to be a float. And I'm going to call this the dissolve %. And we're going to connect our dissolve % to our value here. And I'll throw in a couple of reroute nodes. And what this is going to do is it's going to take in a value of between 0 and 1, and it's going to set the parameter in our dynamic material for each one of the materials that we're dissolving. So I'm going to go ahead and put a comment box around this, and we'll call this the set dissolve %. And then we can go ahead and rearrange it as such. And that is all we're going to need to do in our component. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to open up our enemy character blueprint. And I'm going to go ahead and we're going to go to the bottom here. And we're going to want to create a new custom event. So we're going to go ahead and add a custom event. And we're going to go ahead and we're going to call this do the dissolve. And this will actually handle the dissolving of the materials. So we're going to need to add a component. So up here in the Components tab, I'm going to click on Add Component. And I'm going to search for our dissolve component. We're going to go ahead and add that in. And now we have a reference to our dissolve component over here. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to grab our dissolve component. And if we drag off of here and we search for the set dissolve %, we can actually grab that event to set the dissolve %. Now we have to actually pop in a value here. And this is where I want to go ahead and do a timeline. So from our do dissolve, we only want to start this ever once. So I'm going to perform a do once. And after we perform the do once, we're going to go ahead and add in a timeline. So we'll click on add timeline. And we'll call this the dissolve timeline. And we want to connect it just into the play. And actually, just to make sure, let's go ahead and break this. We can plug it into play from start. That'll be perfectly fine. So we're going to double click on our timeline. And we're going to go ahead and add in a float track. So we're going to have to add in, set a length here. I'm going to set this to 2 seconds. And that's going to be the amount of time that our dissolve takes place. So I'm going to right click in the graph. We're going to add a key. And I'm going to right click again and add a second key. I'm going to select the first key. We're going to set the time to 0 and the value to 0. And then we're going to select the second float key. We'll set the time to 2 and the value to 1. So basically, it's just going to progress at a steady time frame. At 0 seconds, it's going to be a value of 0. And at 2 seconds, it's going to be a value of 1. So we can go ahead and we can give this track a name. And we'll call it the dissolve %. And we can close out of our timeline. So we're going to connect our update into the set dissolve % here. And then we can simply plug our dissolve % from our dissolve timeline into the set dissolve %. And we can put a comment box around this. And we're going to call it our dissolve materials. And then finally, we're going to have to actually tell this event to kick off. So at the end of our event take damage, after we end up setting our collision, we're going to want to go ahead and tell that event to occur. So we're going to search for the do dissolve. And we're going to go ahead and compile and save. And let's go ahead and test everything out. So we have our enemy here, and I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to kill him. And he dies. All right, and it seems it's not working, and it has to do with one thing I forgot to do. In our dissolve component here, we set the get meshes to create all the dynamic materials, but we never actually call the get meshes. So in the dissolve component from our event begin play, we're going to go ahead and we're going to call get meshes. And we're going to go ahead and compile and save this. And let's go ahead and try it again. So I'm going to go ahead and shoot our enemies here. And when they die, they sort of dissolve away. The weapon doesn't dissolve away because we never went ahead and added the function into the weapon material. So we can go ahead and have that happen. And it seems like the 2 seconds seems like a long time. So I might go ahead and change that in our timeline. So first off, in order to go ahead and change up the time frame, we're going to go into the enemy character blueprint. And I'm going to modify this timeline. And so I'm going to go ahead and set the time of our second to, say, 1.5 seconds. And we'll set the time track to 1.5 seconds as well. And we'll compile and save that. And then we're going to have to go ahead and modify the materials for the weapons as well. So, for some reason, it's showing all the engine content in here. Let's go ahead and we'll go into our weapons and into the actual weapon packs itself. In the weapons folder, there's a materials. And this is something that you're going to have to do for all of the master materials, depending on how your weapons are made. But in this case, we have a bunch of material instances. And then we have one weapon master material. So this is going to make it really easy for us. We're just going to have to go ahead and grab the master material here. And we're just going to have to make the change to the master. So we want to go ahead and we want to add our dissolve function to it. So let's go ahead and find that dissolve function. And we're going to go ahead and we're going to drag our dissolve function into the weapon material here. And once again, we're going to have to go ahead and break the material attributes. And then for the weapon material here, we're going to have to make sure that it is a surface, and we're going to have to change the blend mode to masked. Now, the one thing we're going to have to deal with here is there's an actually already emissive color involved. So we can straight up plug the opacity mask into the opacity mask, but we have to deal with this emissive color already being there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and we're going to search for an add. And we're going to go ahead and we're going to take the plug for this emissive color and plug it into the add. And then for the emissive color here, I'm going to trace that emissive back to here. And I'm going to plug that into the A. And we're going to plug this into the emissive color. So let's go ahead and hit save. And once this finishes building the material, or compiling the shaders, we're going to go ahead and we're going to save all. And let's try this to see if it dissolves the weapons. So it goes ahead and dissolves the weapons. Same thing with that character. So it ends up effectively making the meshes for the enemies invisible with a nice little transition effect. And the last thing we really need to do is in the base enemy character here, after we end up calling, let's see, where is it? Here we go. After we end up calling the do dissolve, this takes 1.5 seconds to complete. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to set lifespan. And we're going to set the target to ourselves, and we're going to set a lifespan to 2 seconds. So after this dissolve completes, after 1.5 seconds, there'll be a half second, and then the actor will destroy itself. So the enemy will no longer exist. So I'm going to go ahead and compile and save this. And once again, I'm just going to hit save all. And let's go ahead and hit play. And one last test here. So I destroy them. And one thing we can do is we can actually take a look at our world outliner here, because these enemy characters are actually added into the map. Let's go back over to our gameplay here. We can actually watch them. So after we end up killing him, after a couple of seconds, the actor is deleted. So the actual enemy character is destroyed at that point and no longer exists. So that's going to complete today's video. If you guys have any questions or comments, you can go ahead and leave them down below, or you can stop by my Facebook page and comment or message me over there. And as always, guys, thanks for watching.